The New York Jets have only just begun training camp, yet the fireworks are already flying. Hello, everyone, and welcome. If you are joining us after this late hour, please give us a like and a subscribe as we are reacting to Denzel Mims being traded to the Detroit Lions moments ago as the New York Jets' former second-round wide receiver has been dealt. There is so much to get into, but I'll give the Jets this. They are quick on the trigger. Just hours after the team announced that they would be looking to move Denzel Mims, and if they couldn't move him, they would be cutting him. The Jets finally get a trade partner to Ian Rappaport. Now, all the details at this moment haven't been finalized, but according to Rappaport, it's a conditional six-rounder and a seventh-round pick for the Jets in 2025. So the Jets get two picks. They get a seventh-rounder in 2025, and they also get a sixth-rounder. The question is, what is the conditions of that pick? Now, I wonder if it's probably going to be linked to playing time, maybe contingent on Denzel Mims making the roster. If I had to put money on it at this point, again, if you are watching this video after the fact, this is just moments after the trade. So I am trying to gauge what I believe it is. I believe it's something like 50% of the snaps. Maybe it kicks up to a fifth-round pick. Overall, though, the Jets get two draft picks for a player they were likely going to cut, and now the Jets have added some key additional picks when considering that next season the Jets will likely not have their first-round pick going into the NFL draft. There is a lot to break down on this. Guys, I want your reactions in the comments. I want to hear from you. And again, if you're joining the channel tonight, I also was going to do a special video, on Friday. And if you still have time, in the community page on this YouTube channel, like and subscribe, but go and vote. Do you want me to do the top 5 position battles or the top 5 Hard Knocks storylines going into camp? I think that I'm going to get to both, but which one do you want first? But let's get to Denzel Mims. There is a big section of Jet fans that I believe will be bummed out about this deal because Denzel Mims has become almost like a Paul Bunyan-like folk hero among Jets fans, where Denzel Mims didn't get the right trims, didn't get the full opportunity. But at the end of the day, this was a move that makes a lot of sense for the New York Jets, and I don't think it really hurts them and their prospects going forward. Look, the Jets, I keep going back to this infamous draft with Joe Douglas, where many people are pointing out, and to an extent, they have a bit of a point, which is that the first draft for Joe Douglas, it isn't looking too pretty. But I always equate that, and I almost give Douglas a pass on that draft for a big reason. Number one, it was in the middle of the pandemic, which was a difficult year to draft for anyone. But number two, and the biggest reason of all, he was drafting for Adam Gase, a coach with a vastly different scheme, a vastly different ideals of what he wanted in a player. It's clear that Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh have a better understanding and a better relationship on the types of players that they want to build this program around. Whereas for Adam Gase wanted guys like Denzel Mims, guys that can stretch the field, bigger, taller receivers that can win 50-50 balls. Where Robert Saleh in this West Coast system, they want players that can attack a defense, that are great route runners, that are great in separation and creating separation. And I always go back to this for people saying, well, the Jets really wanted Denzel Mims. No, they didn't. Don't kid yourself. Let me rewind the clock back to that draft, shall we? The Jets were on the clock, if you remember. Maybe you forgot, but let me repaint the picture. The Jets were on the clock in the second round. And guess what? Denzel Mims was there. And the Jets could have selected him. But instead, they propelled back 13 picks to get an additional pick. And eventually drafted him. But that in and of itself should tell you all you need to know. If the Jets were that confident that Denzel Mims was going to be a great player, that they want him that badly, that they were shocked he was there and they got that great value, they would have selected it. Now, do I think they took him because at that point, he was probably the best guy with upside? They were hoping maybe that they had some veterans in front of him that he could learn behind and eventually develop into Adam Gase's system? Maybe. But it is clear that Denzel Mims needed a change of scenery. It wasn't working here. And unfortunately for Mims, he had bad luck here. Got hurt early in his rookie season, got food poisoning going into his second season, and really got buried behind superior players. Elijah Moore, even though he's been dealt, is a better player. The Jets found a stud wide receiver in Garrett Wilson. He's a better player. And you look at the Jets wide receiving core right now, at the very best, Denzel Mims was going to be the sixth wide receiver on this depth chart, and he doesn't play special teams. And the Jets have a bunch of young guys, undrafted guys that they have brought in to compete for that sixth spot. And I think there's a lot that went into this. Number one, Denzel Mims is in a contract year. Do the Jets have confidence that he's going to be back? And is it worth it keeping a player with a second round cap hit on this team when you're already up against the cap and you can get a cheaper option? Number two, if some of these young drafted guys work, you have a better chance of locking them up for a cheaper value. And it also tells me that the Jets really like some of the players that they have brought in through the undrafted free agency process, because if they weren't confident that there are some decent players in this group, I don't think Mims gets traded. Now, did the Jets get what you'd want back for a former second round pick? Absolutely not. But this was the best they were going to do. They ended up getting 2 draft picks. And at the end of the day, are these draft picks that where they are now likely going to shift the tide and getting a great player or finding a stud in the 6th or 7th round? Probably not. But why is it important to add those picks? It gives you ammunition to trade if you want to trade for a player. Don't forget the Jets traded for James Robinson season last year for a conditional 6th or 5th round pick. Who's to say at the deadline this year if the Jets have a need? Maybe safety. Maybe there's a veteran out there on a bad team where the Jets can give this 6th round pick in order to bring a veteran in. It also could be used to trading up. The Jets likely are not going to have a 1st round pick, but maybe this could be a part of a package to move back into the 1st round or to move up into the 2nd round. This pick gives the Jets flexibility. And depending on what the compensation is, and I'm just going to refresh Ian Rappaport's page because I'm just making sure he hasn't updated the official terms of the deal yet. But once again, it's a conditional 6th rounder for the Jets, and they get a guaranteed 7th rounder in 2025. So the Jets are basically getting an additional pick. Now, we don't know the parameters at this point of what that compensation pick or that conditional pick, is going to be. But the one thing I will say, though, is this is also not a great team, I think, for Denzel Mims to go to. Because Denzel Mims was looking for a team to get playing time with. And you look at the Lions right now. They have Josh Reynolds. They have Marvin Jones Jr., Amon-Ra St. Brown. They have some good guys already in that room. And I just think it's going to be tough for him to make that roster. Now, clearly, Detroit, he fits the scheme. He fits it what they're looking for, a big outside threat. And look, the Lions are taking a low risk right here. They're rolling the dice that they can get a game-breaking wide receiver and that can fit. And if Denzel Mims becomes a success with the Lions, I don't put that on the Jets for failing. We have to understand in the NFL, and I think with fans, we get maybe disillusioned, maybe because we play Madden all the time and Madden doesn't account for schemes. But you look at certain guys, when schemes change, they don't fit. Denzel Mims was a square peg in a round hole. He was a guy that couldn't create separation with his route running. He wasn't a crisp route runner. He wasn't great at staying healthy. And despite his athleticism, there was a lot of problems. Denzel Mims last year, if you remember, how many times in a game did he have more penalties than catches? Seriously. Denzel Mims also has the same amount of touchdowns as you and me in the NFL right now. Between all of us, we all have the same amount of touchdowns as Denzel Mims has in his NFL career. Not exactly great for a second-round pick. But this, to me, is also showing that is Hard Knocks, even though the Jets have said they're not going to give too much information, are the Jets just nipping storylines in the butt? Because two of the biggest storylines going into Hard Knocks was going to be Quinnen Williams' extension. That's off the list. And then Denzel Mims, could he be traded during this training camp? And before the end of the first day, he is out. I think it's telling, too, that the Jets know they have 5 receivers and that they are likely going to go with one of their undrafted kids as the sixth spot. It doesn't make sense with Denzel Mims, who has always kind of been an odd fit with this coaching staff. You heard that people didn't necessarily love his practice habits. That's one of the reasons Braxton Berrios shot over him on the depth chart, because of how hard he worked in practice and how much versatility he could bring to the table, where Denzel Mims was basically a one-trick pony. He was basically, could he stretch the field? And even then, he didn't create great separation. Now, in a different scheme, with a better quarterback, with a different offensive coach, could Denzel Mims have thrived in New York? Absolutely. Could he thrive in Detroit? I don't know if he'll thrive, but could he find a good role and be a good player in Detroit? Certainly possible. They have a good quarterback. They have a lot of good weapons there. They're a good offense. Maybe they find a role for him. I'm not saying Denzel Mims is going to roll into Detroit and become someone that catches 4 or 5 balls for 80 yards a week, but maybe he has a couple of big plays this year. But with the Jets, he wasn't going to get that opportunity. And when you're trying to fill out a 53-man roster, you need to start thinking about versatility as you get lower and lower on that depth chart. And when you look at what Denzel Mims provided, doesn't provide special teams, doesn't provide kick return ability. It's basically almost like a dead roster spot for a guy that it's clear that the Jets didn't really love. And before I get to your comments, I know a lot of people are going to criticize the Jets. Another bad second-round pick, another bad receiver pick. But here's my thought, and for those of you new to the channel, I like front offices that are decisive. The one thing I hate in sports is when a front office messes up or makes a bad decision, but continues to double down on it to try to prove that they made the right decision. Now, people are going to say, well, what about Zach Wilson? Well, Zach Wilson, it's a quarterback. It's completely different in the NFL. But with all the other positions in the NFL, especially the amount of receivers you get in a draft every single year, with how many great athletes there are at the wide receiver position in this league right now, you cannot tell me that it makes sense to keep trying to make something work that isn't working. And I'd rather have an organization like the Jets admit, hey, Denzel Mims ain't working. We're going to move off of it. Elijah Moore wasn't working with this Jet team. They moved him out. They were worried about him being a head case on this team. They moved him out. I'd rather have a team that has a goal, an identity, but more importantly, has a plan and is decisive than a team that's trying to make bad decisions work just to save face. The New York Jets are telling you and their fan base and the NFL, we don't care if we make mistakes. We will adjust and correct them. We're not the old Jets that are going to keep trying to trot out Stephen Hill to try to make that work, or try to make up excuses and try to keep making something work, which clearly isn't working. I give the Jets a lot of credit for this deal. They end up getting draft picks. Like, personally, I didn't think that the Jets were going to get anything for Denzel Mims. I really did not believe this, and credit on Connor Hughes for getting this story first for SNY. I didn't think the Jets were going to get anything. And a part of me was a little disappointed when the Jets announced this today, because it kind of took a lot of the leverage. But Joe Douglas, if you were expecting Joe Douglas to fleece a team for a 4th-round pick, that wasn't going to happen. The fact that the Jets are getting 2 tangible draft picks back And I get that they're 7th and 6th rounders. The way I look at rounds 5, 6, and 7, yeah, you're looking for diamonds or depth pieces. But for me, those are great trade chips. The Jets took a chance with James Robinson last year. We've seen teams deal late 3rd round picks to try to get players. Could that be a pick that later on this year at the trade deadline? Maybe the Jets are thin at safety. Maybe the Jets are thin inside at defensive tackle. Maybe the Jets want to upgrade the athleticism in the linebacker position. Maybe there's a running back on a bad team that they want to keep boosting the running game with. It gives them flexibility and it gives them options to bring in more key pieces for this team. So I think it was a job well done by Joe Douglas and this front office. Ben Jesus starts off, I feel bad, but not that bad. He just couldn't get the mental aspect down. At least we didn't trade him to a team we actually play this year. Look, I just don't think that – I get that Jet fans were worried he was going to have a revenge game. But look, I also think it's going to be tough. The Lions have a good receiving room. I thought he might go to a team with thin receivers, have a chance to maybe get into the top 4, but I think it's going to be tough for him to even break the top 4 in Detroit. They have some good receivers. They wanted their wide receiver coach's boy, but he went just before Mims. Van Jefferson. Okay, I get what you're saying there. Billy SBC, if it works out, then it's a total win for the Lions. How many bad draft picks does Bill Belichick have? The draft is always a crapshoot. Yeah, it absolutely is. And look, if it works out for the Lions, you know what? It's a great trade for them. The thing with the Jets is, and Jet fans, I know you hate seeing players go other places and be successful. It wasn't going to work here. Denzel Mims was not going to make an impact on this team. He didn't have a long-term future with this team. And look, I understand that Robert Saleh might not have a long-term future with this team depending on this season. But if the Jets win this year and they make the playoffs, he's still going to be in charge, and likely Denzel Mims isn't going to be a piece of this team. He's not going to be a long-term aspect. Look, the Jets have tried all last year. In the last 18 months, there's been opportunity for Mims. And every time Mims has been on the field, like we laughed last year, Mims finally gets opportunities in games. And he gets offsides penalties. He gets lining up in the improper position penalties. Like, as a coaching staff, I get you're not playing a lot, but if you cannot do what kids in youth football know what to do, is check in with the referee to make sure you're on or off the line of scrimmage, you can't trust a guy to go out there and make big plays. And look, there's been times there's been injuries when Mims could have stepped up, when Mims could have been out on the field, and he just didn't make the most of his opportunities. And I'm not saying Denzel's a bad kid, but this is someone that just, it wasn't going to work out. This was someone that had drops. The Jets also, for people arguing that, well, the Jets could have basically used this preseason to drive up his value. NFL teams have years of tape on Mims. NFL teams know what Mims is at this point. They have game film. They have preseason film. Preseason football for a guy at this point isn't going to do much. Maybe last year it might have done a little something, but it's very telling when the Jets, who had some receiver injuries at different points, don't trust you. The Lions are basically taking this deal because if Mims doesn't work out for them, they don't lose anything. The Jets were going to cut him. That tells you what the Jets thought of him. They were just trying to get something for him. And the fact that they got something for him, to me, is a great deal. They get 2 draft picks. They're not great picks, but they're picks you can use in trades. They're picks you can use to trade up. They're picks you can use to acquire depth. It gives you options and flexibility moving forward that you wouldn't have otherwise. You would have just cut Denzel Mims and just opened up a roster spot. But it also makes it more interesting for this preseason because now we're going to be watching a lot of these young kids. The Jets have brought in a bunch of undrafted wide receivers. One of them is likely going to make the team as the 6th receiver. It's going to be fun to watch. It's going to be interesting. And for the Jets, it makes a budget sense. They're getting rid of a 2nd-round cap hit for an undrafted player who's likely going to give you the same exact production as Denzel Mims and the fact that you got a draft pick. And I'll go out on a limb and say I don't think the Jets are necessarily done trading some players. Look, I know Rich Cimini put out a tweet earlier. What was funny, he put out a tweet that the Jets might look to shop Becton during training camp. And then I think 3 hours later, he put out a tweet saying, well, Mekhi Becton's lost 50 pounds and looks in great shape. I think that I would be hard pressed to see him go. But could guys like maybe Ashton Davis, if another team likes what they see from him, Bryce Hall, the cornerback, there's some players on this team that you wonder, can they make this roster? And if the Jets have a roster question with them, is it better to just trade them and get something instead of nothing? Get a draft pick. And I just look at Mims. Like, Mims had more penalties, I think, last year than catches, or it certainly felt like that. And I get it. I felt bad. And I was one of those people saying, look, give Denzel Mims an opportunity. And when the Jets finally did, I think Jet fans saw what the coaches have been seeing in practice, because Jet coaches, like, the quarterback is different in the NFL. You have to ride it out. But the Jets have seen Denzel Mims in practice. They've seen what he can do. And they're just going, I think what's also alarming with Mims, too, is when you look at some of his stats, there are some troubling stats. He is not an efficient receiver. Catch percent, 45.7. So he's catching less than half the balls he's targeted in his career. Denzel Mims has been targeted 92 times, 25 times last year. Last year, 11 catches against 25 attempts. In his career, 42 attempts, 42 catches against 92 targets. Denzel Mims, the last 2 seasons, in 21 games, including 7 games where he started, has just over 300 total yards and didn't get over 200 yards in a single season in 2021 or in 2022. Denzel Mims has upside and ability that a lot of players don't have. But we've also seen a lot of players come and go in the NFL who have great upside, but at the end of the day, they just couldn't put all the pieces together, and it just feels like he's one of those guys. And I will always remember a key thing about Denzel Mims. And this is something that I will never forget. And D-Town Heat thanking the Jets. Well, take a guy that catches less than 50% of his targets. Okay, good luck. I have a serious question. Is Denzel Mims going to make the roster in Detroit? There's a chance he doesn't even make the roster out of camp. But what always struck me, and this should have, I think, been a clear warning for Jet fans, was we forget in that draft, Matt Rule, the guy who recruited Denzel Mims to Baylor, who was his Baylor coach, had multiple picks and multiple opportunities before the Jets got on that clock the second time to draft Denzel Mims. Did you notice how Cliff Kingsbury, who tried to get Kyler Murray but couldn't, fell in love and did everything to get him? Now, in retrospect, it didn't work out. But have you noticed how certain college coaches, when they come to the league, they tend to either draft guys that they had on their team or draft guys that they highly recruited? That's one of the reasons Pete Carroll, when he first came to Seattle, was so great, because it wasn't just USC players. He knew what players he wanted from recruiting. And I just looked at that, and it was kind of odd because Denzel Mims was supposed to be, there were talks he could be a late first-round pick potentially. And the fact that his own college coach, the coach that recruited him, the coach that had him for 3 years, the coach that developed him, the coach that got him to the point where he could be a top 64 draft pick in the NFL draft, didn't want to take him. That, to me, was very telling. But again, I don't blame Joe Douglas. He was shopping for a terrible chef in Adam Gase. Adam Gase wanted him to fit this system, and Joe Douglas, a first-time GM in a COVID draft, said, okay, like, I'm going to try to get you the players that you think are going to fit your scheme. Then a year later, you get a whole new coach, a whole new scheme and ideology, and Denzel Mims was a square peg in a round hole. Jets did pretty good considering Mims has really no resume, and the little info you have on him, half of it is not good. No, it is not good. Abby Fresh, about time he got rid of Mims. I think Jet fans are kind of 50-50 on that. We'll see what happens. It's worth a shot until JMO comes back. Okay, D-Town here. Again, I want to hear from you because I'm looking at your depth chart. You have Josh Reynolds. You have Marvin Jones. You have Amon-Ra St. Brown, who I really like. I mean, you have Antoine Green. You have Khalif Raymond. I mean, you have some pretty good receivers. And I'm like, seriously, like, do you really feel that Denzel Mims is going to crack your top 3 or even your top 4? I think the best that they're going to do in Detroit is get him as the 5th receiver. I'm also wondering, too, if maybe one interesting thing with Detroit could be is one of the receivers maybe nicked up and we don't know about it. Because sometimes you see this, a team will pull off a trade, and then a day or two later, oh, by the way, this guy has a banged up knee. He's going to be out for a couple weeks. So I'm curious to see. I'm curious to see what happens there. Detroit fans are going to want to trade him back. Oh, it could be very true. Yeah, and like the thing too is I just look at this trade for the Jets and look, they just get assets. You needed assets, and the Jets are going to release them. They got something for Mims. You got some value. My biggest thing, especially if you know you're going to cut a player or probably cut a player, get a pick back. It doesn't have to even be a good pick. Just get a pick back. Because that pick could be used to get a veteran at the deadline. Could be used to trade up. Like if next year in the draft, let's say it doesn't go higher than a 6th-round pick. Let's say hypothetically. What if the Jets decide to package a 2nd, a 4th, and that 6th-round pick to go up into the high 2nd round to get a good player, or the late 1st round to get a key player? It'll be worth it to get someone that could contribute. Like, you have to think ahead. And Joe Douglas loves his draft picks, loves flexibility. And the Jets are likely, let's be honest, not going to have a 1st-round pick next year, so they're going to have to get creative and be creative with how they acquire draft assets. And the fact that they're able to bring in another draft pick to give them flexibility to move up next year, I do think is very key. Was the Jets QB play another factor of Mims not succeeding there? I mean, you can make that as a good point, D-Town Heat, but I don't know. I mean, Garrett Wilson did pretty good without a bad quarterback. Elijah Moore had flashes despite the bad quarterback play. I mean, Mims, like, as a 2nd-round pick, it's almost hard to go 3 seasons without a touchdown. I mean, we're talking 3 seasons without a touchdown for Denzel Mims. Denzel Mims has 600 career yards in the NFL in 30 games, 15 starts. That ain't good. That is not good. And this is someone that when you look at his catch percentage, since his rookie year, 34% in 2021, 44% last season. Translation, he isn't even catching half the balls that are being thrown to him. That is not efficient. Quarterback ratings throwing to Mims. 2021, 55.2 rating. Last year, 53.1 rating. Drop percent. Last year, the drop percent that Denzel Mims had was 12%. A 12% drop rate. In his last year, Denzel Mims had less than 100 yards, had 75 yards after the catch. Couldn't even get 100 yards after the catch. Now look, in Detroit, I'll tell you, you got a kid with measurables. You got someone that's 6'3", 200 pounds and can run a 4.38 40. You got someone with explosiveness. And look, I think, to be honest with you, especially D-Town Heat, he fits your system better than what the Jets have right now. But I am just looking at this right now where Mims had opportunities to get playing time last year. And I agree with Abby Fresh. He had a lot of playing times. And Ben Jesus brings up a great point. Jeff Smith got a lot more playing time over Denzel Mims. Braxton Berrios, a good role player, got more playing time than Denzel Mims. If you could name a receiver on the New York Jets the last 3 seasons, they likely had more yards than Denzel Mims or played a more pivotal role than Denzel Mims. That is not a good thing when you're looking at someone's career. I mean, I'm just looking at like last year, just receiving in terms of yards. It just, Denzel Mims on the team was slightly ahead of Braxton Berrios, who the Jets used more in gadget plays, but Berrios also had multiple touchdowns. I mean, I just look at it and look, you might be getting a good player here, Detroit. You might get someone that gets a wake-up call. This might be an option too, where this is a guy who, unfortunately, didn't work out in New York. And sometimes this might be a wake-up call. Wait a minute. The team that drafted me as a second-round pick, because I don't think when you're drafted that high, even as a second-round pick, you almost get a false sense of security. Like, they've invested guaranteed money in me. They've invested such a high pick. They're not going to move off of me. Like, I'm comfortable. But sometimes you need to be uncomfortable. And I do think for Mims, this is a shot at NFL mortality. The NFL, sometimes players get it on their second team because they realize, oh, if it doesn't work out here, I might not be playing anymore in this league. Especially if you're Mims. The NFL draft, how many receivers come in every year? And is a team going to be more willing to draft a receiver in the second or third round than try to use you as a retread? Because at least when they do that and that receiver pops off, well, guess what? They don't have to pay him for 2 or 3 years. If you have one good season, all of a sudden, receivers, even receivers, they're getting $12, $13 million a year. And look, for the Jets, I think it was unrealistic expectations maybe on Mims. But the other thing I look at with Mims too, and this kind of goes back to this story, and I started this video off, and I don't know if you heard me, D-Town Heat, but I always go back to 2 things that alarmed me on draft night, or that were pretty telling about what the Jets and the NFL thought about Denzel Mims. The first was Matt Rule, the coach that had him at Baylor, the coach that wanted him, the coach that goes to Carolina, has multiple picks. Carolina needs a wide receiver. Denzel Mims is on the board a couple of times. The kid that he's recruited, coached at Baylor, had at Baylor, and he didn't want anything to do with him. I thought that was telling. And the other thing, too, is the Jets had an opportunity to draft Mims earlier in the draft. They traded back 13 spots in the second round. And at that point, I think it was a situation where the Jets in the second round, especially in that COVID year, were going, well, there's no one we really love at this point. Let's take a shot on the kid with the higher measurables. Maybe he's got a little bit more upside than some of these other guys. And I also think that Joe Douglas learned from that. Joe Douglas went a lot of measurables in that first draft, if you notice. You notice his first 3 picks? Becton, Mims, Davis. Guys that maybe didn't have enough playing experience, but you looked at the measurables, were off the charts. But if you've noticed the last 2 years, Douglas has tweaked that. Still loves the high measurables, the freak athletes, but he's looking for guys that maybe have worked a little bit harder in the weight room, maybe a little bit more committed, and have had a better track record in college than some of these guys. So I do think that you have to take that into consideration. D-Town Heat, we'll see. I doubt they draft. I doubt they sign Cook because I don't think the Jets want to pay him, and I do think Hall's going to be at least ready to go week 2. but we'll see. I mean, if the price keeps dropping, the Jets might just say, you know what, we could get Cook for a steal. Especially if you look at the running back market; it's horrible right now. The Jets could get Dalvin Cook for $5 or $6 million a year. They might just have to do it just because of the value. I thought Mims was a can't miss when we drafted him. I think we all did, but I mean that draft. Abby, I get what you're saying with that draft. We also have to remember too that draft was such a weird draft because yes, you had preseason the same way, like you had like the initial sorry, I got tongue tied. You had a lot up to the combine. You had the normal situation. But then afterwards, you didn't have the pro days. You didn't have the same meetings because of COVID. And then you had that virtual draft. I mean, it wasn't a great draft. And like I look back at that draft and I brought it up right in front of me. You know, the Jets, of course, drafted Mekhi Becton. I mean, outside of CeeDee Lamb in that first round, we know what happened to Henry Ruggs and Justin Jefferson. I mean, there were some great receivers that you would have loved in the first round. It's a great first round for receivers. Then we get into the second round. T. Higgins, good receiver. Michael Pittman, good receiver, went early. Jets, of course, traded back a couple times. They had the 48th pick in the draft. They traded back with Seattle at that point. Just looking at some of the guys on the board that were there. Van Jefferson went ahead. Then the Jets were on the clock with Mims. Kind of after that point, like you look at the receivers after that, it wasn't a lot of great receivers. I mean, you got Bryan Edwards. Like really after that first round, the quality dipped. And look, the Jets just needed offensive line so bad at that point. But look, LaMichael P. Ryan. Yeah, it was a bad draft. It wasn't a good draft. But I also give Douglas a bit of a pass on that draft because, again, he was drafting for a very different coach who wanted very different types of players. And you look the last 2 years, I think the drafts have been great because the GM and the coach have a better understanding and they know what each other wants. I mean, Adam Gase, I don't think know what the hell he wants. I mean, Adam Gase didn't even know he looked like a crazy person at his freaking press conference. And you're asking Joe Douglas to draft players for that guy? It wasn't going to work out. But I look at it in detail. Like, I'm still waiting for your response. I don't know if you're still here. I mean, I'm asking a serious question. Is there any chance, like looking at your receivers now, because you probably have a better understanding of the Lions receiver room than we do as Jet fans, do you really believe that Denzel Mims is going to crack the top 5? Like at the best, do you see him being the 4th receiver on that team? I think at best right now, if there's no injuries, Mims is maybe the 5th receiver. Maybe I'm wrong. I just look at, I think you have a good top 3. Maybe I don't know as much about the 4th and the 5. I feel like I have a decent bit of knowledge on the Lions, but I'm just curious. Like, I don't think the Lions were a team that really were that desperate at wide receiver. Like I always thought that a team that made sense to me was maybe kind of like the Bears. I know they've added Claypool, but they're kind of a team that needed receivers. The Titans, before they added DeAndre Hopkins, were a team. And the Cardinals are kind of this weird rebuild. I don't know if maybe they might be a decent fit for Mims or a place where he can go to try to resurrect his career. But to me, this was a great move by Joe Douglas. It was a move where you get some pieces back. And look, for Mims, if it works out in Detroit, I hope it works out. Sometimes players, it just works out better. Quincy Williams was not playing in Jacksonville. He comes to the Jets, and he's able to play and gets a contract. John Franklin Myers wasn't getting action with the Rams. He comes to the Jets, fits in, and becomes a very successful player. I mean, you see it all the time that there are certain players that you think might fit, and they just don't. James Robinson, the Jets, I was excited about the James Robinson trade. I thought he'd be a good fit. Turns out he wasn't. That's the NFL. Sometimes you feel a kid could be an absolutely perfect fit. You get him in the building, you get him in practice, and you realize maybe not as good of a fit as we thought. Mims, we have to always remember what that 2020 draft was always going to be odd, because you had a GM, in his first draft, drafting for a head coach that was a bit desperate and that basically I don't think had any clue. So you had then that draft class come in their second season and have to learn a new system. A draft class that in their first year, they didn't have the benefit of all the preseason because of COVID. I mean, that 2020 draft class, a lot of those kids got the shaft because of the lack of opportunity and the lack of training camp that they actually got to participate in. And you're asking Denzel Mims, who got banged up his first season, to come back, get sick his second season, and the Jets just added so much talent. And part of this is Joe Douglas's credit. They've gotten to a point where they can move off of Denzel Mims because they've added so much talent to the wide receiver room. I think it's telling, too, that the Jets have a role for Corey Davis this year because they've kept him on despite the cap hit. And with Denzel Mims, let's face it, it's a second-round pick that's been a bust who hasn't had a touchdown catch in 3 seasons. And someone that's going to be a free agent at the end of this year. Does it make sense to keep someone as a 6th receiver on a second-round pick salary cap, taking up a roster spot from a guy who maybe that's not as talented as Mims, but can play special teams, can do kick returns, adds more flexibility to a roster? It just makes all the sense in the world. And look, I give the Jets credit. Being decisive. They were decisive. They were able to move off. And look, the Jets clearly have a plan, and the Jets are a decisive team. This is exciting if you're a Jet fan because you don't have a team that's waiting around. You have a team that's aggressive. And look, this trade isn't over, technically. We don't know what the conditions of that pick are. We'll probably find out more, especially as we get close to the draft. And even if it just is a 6th-round pick, the Jets get 2 draft picks. If that 6th or 7th-round pick turns into a trade where the Jets trade up for a great piece, it's a good move. If the Jets use it to add a veteran at the trade deadline, who's to say they use that 6th-round pick? Maybe they add depth on the offensive line. Maybe they add a piece in the safety secondary, add a safety. Maybe they add some more speed and athleticism to the linebacking core. This gives the team flexibility. And the best thing you want in the NFL is to have the flexibility to add pieces and to build your roster. And the Jets did that with a guy who they basically told the NFL world, look, if you don't give us something, we're probably going to cut him. Like there are people in probably Detroit that don't like this trade because I guarantee you there's going to be at least a couple hosts in Detroit going tomorrow. Wait a minute. If the Lions really love Denzel Mims this much, why didn't they just wait 24 hours, wait for the Jets to just cut him and bring him in? Now, was there a second team that was showing interest in Mims? And maybe the Lions looked at their depth chart and were going, well, he's not going to want to come here as a free agent maybe, so let's go out and get him with the draft picks. Maybe that was the situation. But also, if you're Detroit, are you a little bit worried that maybe there's an injury to a player already that no one's really discussing? But guys, if you're new to the channel, make sure you hit that like, subscribe button, follow all our latest Jets content, and of course, go to the community page. Tell me what you want to see. Top 5 position battles or Hard Knocks storylines going to training camp. But thanks for joining us here. I'm Nolan Rich, and this is Rich Sports Talk.